There's a shadow economy that has quietly shaped American history for over 2 centuries. While textbooks tell stories of heroic battles and noble causes, they rarely mention the families who turned every conflict into a gold mine. These aren't distant oligarchs or foreign conspirators. These are American dynasties with familiar names, operating in plain sight, converting tragedy into treasure with mathematical precision. Picture this scenario. War breaks out somewhere in the world. Within hours, stock prices for certain companies surge. Phone calls are made to Washington. Contracts worth billions materialize overnight. Production lines that were idle suddenly roar to life. And by the time the first shots are fired, a select group of corporations has already calculated their profits down to the last decimal point. This isn't speculation or conspiracy theory. This is documented American capitalism at its most ruthless and efficient. The same family names appear in government contracts spanning from the Revolutionary War to Afghanistan. Generation after generation, they've mastered the art of monetizing conflict while maintaining the perfect public image of patriotic service. What you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you view American foreign policy. Because once you see the financial incentives driving military decisions, once you understand who profits when diplomacy fails, you'll never read a news headline about international tensions the same way again. The pattern is so consistent, it might as well be a mathematical formula. Conflict emerges, certain stocks rise, contracts get awarded, costs balloon beyond recognition, and by the time peace returns, the same families have added another fortune to their generational wealth. The soldiers come home, the taxpayers foot the bill, and the cycle begins anew. Let me walk you through exactly how this machine operates, starting with the family that literally wrote the blueprint for American war profiteering. Their story begins in 1800 when a French chemist stepped off a ship in Delaware with expertise in gunpowder production and an understanding of human nature that would prove more valuable than gold. Eleuthère Irénée DuPont arrived in America with impeccable timing. The young nation had just fought a revolution and was rapidly expanding westward. Every mile of that expansion required explosives for clearing land, mining operations, and the inevitable conflicts with anyone who stood in the way. DuPont recognized an opportunity that would sustain his family for centuries. In 1802, he founded his company along the Brandywine River in Delaware. The location wasn't chosen randomly. Close enough to Philadelphia and Washington for political access, positioned near water power for manufacturing, yet far enough from populated areas that accidental explosions wouldn't create public relations disasters. This strategic thinking would become the hallmark of war profiteering families. When the War of 1812 erupted, DuPont was ready. They had existing manufacturing capacity while competitors scrambled to build facilities. The government needed gunpowder immediately, and DuPont delivered. This first major military contract established a relationship that would endure through every subsequent American conflict. Here's where the genius of their business model becomes apparent. Most companies build capacity to meet demand. War profiteers build capacity to exceed demand, then work to create situations where that excess capacity becomes essential. They don't just respond to wars, they position themselves to benefit from wars that haven't happened yet. The Mexican-American War proved this strategy's effectiveness. DuPont supplied gunpowder worth over $1 million, equivalent to $35 million today. But the real value wasn't the immediate payment, it was cementing their reputation as the government's reliable supplier. When the next conflict arose, there would be no question about who got the contract. Then came the Civil War, and with it, DuPont's transformation from successful company to generational dynasty. The Union Army's appetite for gunpowder was unprecedented. 4 years of continuous warfare across multiple fronts required millions of pounds of explosives. DuPont's factories operated around the clock, producing over 4 million pounds of gunpowder and generating contracts worth over $10 million. But here's where the story gets morally complicated. The DuPont family were Northern Democrats who opposed abolition. Some family members even sympathized with the Confederacy politically. Yet they sold exclusively to the Union because that's where the profitable contracts were located. When ideology conflicted with profit, profit won every time. This flexibility would become another hallmark of war profiteering families. They're not driven by political conviction or national loyalty. They're driven by market opportunities. They'll fund think tanks that advocate for military intervention while simultaneously selling to all sides of a conflict. The cause doesn't matter, the contracts do. After the Civil War ended, DuPont faced a challenge that every war profiteer encounters. How do you maintain a massive production capacity during peacetime? The answer was diversification and patience. They used their gunpowder profits to expand into chemicals and manufacturing while keeping their military production lines ready for the next conflict. World War I provided that next opportunity on a scale that dwarfed everything previous. Before America officially entered the war, DuPont was selling explosives to Britain and France. When the United States joined the fighting, DuPont's production reached unprecedented levels. They supplied 40% of all explosives used by Allied forces. The financial results were staggering. DuPont's net earnings jumped from $5 million in 1914 to $82 million in 1918. That's a 1,600% increase in 4 years. To put that in perspective, they made more profit in those 4 war years than most companies generate in decades. What happened next reveals the true nature of generational wealth building through war profiteering. DuPont didn't return those windfall profits or scale back their operations. They used the money to diversify into chemicals, plastics, and synthetic materials. They built a peacetime empire with wartime profits, then maintained their military contracts as insurance against future conflicts. This pattern would repeat through World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and every subsequent American military engagement. Each conflict generated enormous profits that were then invested in building larger, more diversified business empires. The wars ended, but the wealth compounded across generations. By the time DuPont's defense operations were eventually spun off and merged with other companies in the 2000s, the family fortune had grown to an estimated $30 billion. 6 generations removed from that French chemist, and they're still living off gunpowder money. The DuPont story illustrates the fundamental mechanics of war profiteering, but they weren't alone. 4 other families perfected complementary strategies that turned different aspects of military conflict into generational wealth machines. While DuPont controlled explosives, the Rockefellers monopolized the fuel that powered modern warfare. The Morgan banking dynasty financed the conflicts themselves. Lockheed's predecessors dominated military aviation. And Halliburton created the template for military logistics and infrastructure. Each family developed specialized expertise in their sector, then used that expertise to secure exclusive government relationships that persisted across decades. They didn't compete with each other because they controlled different pieces of the war machine. Instead, they operated as a coordinated system where each family's profits depended on the other's success. The beauty of their strategy was its sustainability. Unlike traditional businesses that face market competition, these families created monopolistic relationships with the only customer that truly mattered: the United States government. And that customer had unique characteristics that made it ideal for exploitation. The government customer operates under fundamentally different rules than private markets. When Apple needs to buy components, they negotiate prices, compare suppliers, and walk away if terms aren't favorable. When the Pentagon needs weapons during wartime, they pay whatever it costs because failure isn't an option. This dynamic creates what economists call a captive market, but war profiteering families prefer to call it patriotic service. Understanding this relationship explains why these families invested so heavily in political connections alongside their manufacturing capabilities. It wasn't enough to build the best products or offer the lowest prices. Success required ensuring that when crisis struck, their phone would ring first. And that meant cultivating relationships that transcended individual politicians or administrations. Take the Rockefeller approach to oil monopolization during the age of modern warfare. John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil in 1870 and spent the next decade systematically destroying every competitor until he controlled 90% of America's oil refining capacity. This wasn't just business strategy, it was preparation for a world where petroleum would become the lifeblood of military power. When the Spanish-American War erupted in 1898, the U.S. Navy was transitioning from coal-powered to oil-powered ships. Suddenly, Standard Oil wasn't just another business, they were a strategic national asset. Naval vessels required fuel oil, and Rockefeller controlled the supply. The war lasted only months, but it demonstrated oil's military necessity and Rockefeller's indispensable position. World War I transformed this advantage into astronomical wealth. Modern warfare required petroleum products for tanks, trucks, airplanes, and ships. Although antitrust action had technically broken up Standard Oil in 1911, the Rockefeller family still controlled the successor companies through stock ownership and interconnected directorships. Exxon, Mobil, Chevron all remained Rockefeller entities in everything but name. Here's where the Rockefeller strategy revealed its sophisticated amorality. While Standard Oil's American operations supplied fuel to U.S. and Allied forces, their German subsidiaries simultaneously sold petroleum products to Germany. Even after America entered the war, Rockefeller companies continued trading with the enemy through neutral countries and shell corporations. This wasn't treason in any legal sense. It was simply business conducted by technically separate corporate entities. And it was brilliantly profitable. By selling to both sides of the conflict, the Rockefellers guaranteed profits regardless of which army ultimately prevailed. The longer the war continued, the more fuel everyone consumed and the wealthier they became. The profits from World War I elevated John D. Rockefeller to become the world's first billionaire. But more importantly, they provided the capital for massive diversification into banking, real estate, and philanthropy. The family used oil money to buy influence in sectors far removed from petroleum, creating multiple income streams that would persist long after their oil monopoly was challenged. World War II saw the same pattern repeated with even greater profits. Rockefeller companies held exclusive contracts to supply fuel to American military operations, while maintaining business relationships with Nazi Germany through subsidiaries and patent-sharing agreements. When Senator Harry Truman investigated these connections, he found that Standard Oil had provided Germany with technology for synthetic rubber production that potentially prolonged the war effort. Truman's committee concluded that Standard Oil's actions had damaged American military effectiveness. But prosecutions never materialized because the company was too strategically important. The military needed their fuel more than justice demanded their punishment. So the investigation was quietly buried, the contracts continued, and the profits kept flowing. This reveals another crucial element of the war profiteering system. These families made themselves indispensable to the very institutions that might otherwise hold them accountable. They didn't just sell products to the military, they became integral to military operations in ways that made criticism or punishment practically impossible. The Rockefeller family eventually began divesting from oil operations in the 1970s as public scrutiny intensified around energy companies. But by then, their estimated $11 billion fortune had been diversified across countless industries and investment vehicles. The wealth built on fuel sold to armies remained intact even as the source of that wealth was obscured. Meanwhile, the Morgan banking dynasty was perfecting the art of war financing, recognizing that conflicts required not just weapons and fuel, but enormous amounts of borrowed money. J.P. Morgan founded his banking empire in the 1870s and quickly understood something that would define a century of war profits. Governments at war will pay any interest rate because the alternative is defeat. The Spanish-American War established Morgan's relationship with government war financing through relatively small loans to the U.S. Treasury, but World War I provided the opportunity for truly transformational profits. When fighting erupted in Europe in 1914, America maintained official neutrality, while American banks, led by J.P. Morgan, lent over $2 billion to Britain and France. Those loans created a financial web that made American neutrality ultimately impossible. By 1917, Allied nations owed so much to American banks that their defeat would have triggered a massive financial crisis in the United States. If Britain and France lost the war, they couldn't repay their debts. American banks would collapse. The domestic economy would crater. When President Wilson asked Congress to declare war in April 1917, the decision wasn't purely about democratic principles or German aggression. It was about protecting American financial interests that had become too large to allow failure. Senator George Norris of Nebraska stated this explicitly during the war declaration debate, arguing that America was entering the conflict upon the command of gold and was about to put the dollar sign on the American flag. The genius of Morgan's strategy was creating situations where American military power became necessary to protect American financial investments. They weren't just profiting from wars, they were creating conditions where wars became financially inevitable for the United States government. After World War I ended, Morgan banks profited again through the complex web of reparations and debt restructuring that followed. Germany owed reparations to the Allies. The Allies owed money to America. Morgan arranged the loans that allowed Germany to pay reparations, which the Allies then used to repay their American debts. Morgan collected fees at every step of this circular financing scheme. The Dawes Plan in 1924 and the Young Plan in 1929, both structured by Morgan bankers, refinanced billions in war debt while generating millions in fees for the bank. They had essentially created a perpetual motion machine where debt from one war financed the next conflict while continuously generating profits for the financial institutions managing the transactions. This financial architecture proved so successful that it was replicated for every subsequent conflict. World War II followed the identical blueprint. Before Pearl Harbor, Morgan banks financed British war purchases through complex lending arrangements. After America entered the fighting, the U.S. government borrowed heavily to fund military operations, and Morgan banks underwrote those treasury securities, collecting fees on every bond issuance. The pattern became self-reinforcing. Wars required financing. Morgan provided that financing. The profits from war loans were then invested in peacetime industries and political relationships that positioned the bank for the next conflict. When Korea erupted, then Vietnam, then the Gulf War, Morgan's successor institution, J.P. Morgan Chase, was always positioned to profit from the financial machinery of warfare. The Morgan family gradually stepped back from day-to-day banking operations, but their estimated $30 billion fortune remains built on interest collected from money lent for wars. They had discovered something profound about the mathematics of conflict. While weapons get consumed and soldiers get killed, debt compounds forever. But weapons themselves remain the most visible and politically sensitive aspect of war profiteering. This is where the aviation industry, led by companies that would eventually become Lockheed Martin, perfected the art of making themselves politically untouchable while systematically overcharging the government for military equipment. The Lougheed brothers, later respelled as Lockheed, founded their aircraft company in 1912, just as military aviation was emerging from experimental curiosity to strategic necessity. World War I provided their first military contracts, small orders for reconnaissance planes and experimental designs. The real money would come later, but they understood something crucial about the defense industry that many competitors missed. Success wasn't just about building good airplanes. It was about building relationships with the people who decided which airplanes to buy. So Lockheed began hiring retired military officers as executives. They located manufacturing facilities in congressional districts where representatives needed jobs for their constituents. They made themselves politically essential in ways that transcended the quality of their products. This strategy proved its worth during World War II when aircraft became decisive weapons. Lockheed built the P-38 Lightning fighter and Hudson bomber, generating hundreds of millions in contracts. But their real innovation was developing what would become known as the revolving door between Pentagon procurement and defense industry employment. 5 families, 2 centuries, every American war. The pattern is undeniable, and it's still happening today. While politicians debate military budgets and generals plan strategies, these dynasties count profits from conflicts they helped create. The next time you hear about international tensions escalating, ask yourself who benefits when diplomacy fails. Because somewhere, stock prices are already rising, and the machine that turns tragedy into treasure is spinning faster than ever.